Dungeons and action-adventure video games are a given in the modern day, and this is pretty largely due to the influence of the beloved Legend of Zelda series. I don't think there's a single Zelda fan out there who doesn't have a favorite dungeon or at least a memory of one, unless you were introduced to the series from Breath of the Wild, in which case you might not know what a dungeon is. No matter how you slice it, Zelda dungeons are in and of themselves staples of the video gaming experience. So it's only natural that the dungeons would also be a big deal as far as storytelling and lore is concerned. In fact, there's such a big deal that I asked the man himself, NintendoBlackCrisis, if he would be so kind as to help me out with explaining all the dungeons in Twilight Princess. And after he finally returned my 50th call or so, he agreed. Everyone say hi.
Well, technically it was only 49 calls, but that's beside the point. This collaboration did give me an excuse to replay Twilight Princess though, which was kind of amazing since it was the one Zelda game I had only ever beaten once, and that was many years ago with the Wii version. As this is a collaboration, we've decided to split the dungeons 50-50, meaning that each part will talk about 4 of this game's dungeons. With the exception of Hyrule
That's enough talking for now. I didn't invite you over here so you could take over the whole video. Be sure to check out the other half of the dungeon explanations over on his channel after you're done here, or hello and welcome to the other half if you're already coming from over there. Oh, and spoiler alert, obviously.
For the first temple we'll be exploring in this video, let's start with the first temple of the game, the Forest Temple. Also, take a shot whenever we say temple in this video. Just kidding, that's a terrible idea. Any fan who's played the game or who's ever perused the forest section of the Zelda Theory forums is no doubt familiar with the symbolism present everywhere in the Forest Temple, and I'm talking specifically about the Kokiri symbols on all the doors. But let's take a few steps back real quick and talk about what the Forest Temple even is. The Forest Temple itself is actually more of an entire area or complex located within the Faron Woods, of intricately interconnected colossal trees, most of which are hollowed out from the insides to make way for all the various rooms and bridges and doors and whatnot. The biggest question, no pun intended, is what's up with these trees? Why are they so massive and grown together like this? Well, let's take yet another several steps back and talk about what Faron Woods is in regards to the rest of Hyrule and see if we can get any clues from that. The previous game in the timeline that actually deals with Hyrule is Ocarina of Time, and in that game there is no Faron Woods on the map. But since this is the same Hyrule from Ocarina of Time as proven by a direct quote from Enuma himself, that means that Twilight Princess's Faron Woods must have originated from somewhere on Ocarina of Time's map of Hyrule. The first and most obvious guess would be the Lost Woods area from Ocarina of Time. I mean, that's also where the Kokiri came from, and it has a large forest area. So naturally, this would be the most obvious answer. Of course, the Hyrule maps from Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess don't exactly match up one-to-one, which could raise some questions on whether or not this really is the same forest area, but we don't have time to create an entire other theory for why Hyrule changed this much in between games, so for now, we're just gonna have to go with the logic of forest equals forest. If this is the case, then not only does that explain the Kokiri symbolism and even the Skull Kid's appearance in the nearby Sacred Grove, but it also reminds us that we have in fact seen a colossal tree surrounded by Kokiri that's hollowed out on the inside to make way for rooms and bridges and doors. That being the Great Deku Tree, which I may add is conveniently missing somehow from Twilight Princess. Now, obviously there is a pretty massive difference in appearance and size between the Great Deku Tree and the Forest Temple, with the latter actually being composed of multiple giant trees. But you've got to admit, the fact that they're both trees, along with the Forest Temple's location and existence of the Kokiri symbolism, is way too deliberate to mean nothing at all. I mean, it's actually rather obvious that the Forest Temple from Twilight Princess was meant to be an enhanced version of the Great Deku Tree dungeon from Ocarina of Time. The only question is, how and why is it the way it is? Well, let's once again cover a bit of backstory from Ocarina of Time for more context. You see, before Link faces Ganondorf as an adult, before he spies on him as a kid, before the game even begins, Ganondorf has already infected the Deku Tree with the parasite known as Goma. At the end of the game, Zelda sends Link back in time, creating the child timeline that spawns the following game Majora's Mask, along with Twilight Princess 1 or 2 centuries later. However, what we'd like to point out in this video is that we can actually see Link after he's sent back in time, when he meets Zelda for the first time, and use this scene to pinpoint exactly when he returned to. Notice how she's spying on someone inside her father's throne room, exactly what we saw her doing when we met her the first time. It can then be assumed that she's doing the same thing and spying on Ganondorf, which means that Link was most likely sent back in time to the same spot that we played through near the beginning of the game. And I'm going over all this to state that it's our belief that, at this point in the child timeline, the Deku Tree had already been infected by Ganondorf, meaning the Deku Tree probably still ended up dying very quickly in the new child timeline that Zelda spawned. Now, one other thing I'd like to mention is that the Deku Tree preemptively planted at least one new giant Deku Tree seed in advance, predicting its own death. And given that the Deku Tree could theoretically have planted multiple seeds like we see it doing in the Wind Waker, all of a sudden we've got a possible explanation for why the Forest Temple of Twilight Princess is composed of a bunch of colossal, hollowed out Deku Tree-like trees. It might even explain how they're able to grow to this size over the span of only 1 to 200 years. If they really are saplings of the original Great Deku Tree, then they're kind of, magic. They can grow pretty quickly, as we see. Actually, on that note, it could even just be one Deku Tree, perhaps even the sapling we see in Ocarina of Time. Why couldn't it grow into a huge nesting of trees? Like the real-life pando-organism in Utah, a giant forest system of approximately 47,000 trees that all share the same genetic code and a single root system, meaning they're all one tree. The last question is probably the most obvious, and that is, why is this forest temple not alive, if it really is the remnants of one or several great Deku trees? Well, this is just speculation, of course, but the simplest answer seems to be due to the corruption of the Deku Baba plant that transformed into the hideous parasite Diababa and introduced monsters that drove out the Kokiri, all thanks to the fused shadow that was placed inside for safekeeping. Yeah, turns out that was probably not the greatest idea since a fused shadow piece has corrupted every dungeon they were placed in. But this way of thinking pretty much explains everything there is to be explained about the Forest Temple of Twilight Princess. Why it's located where it is, why it was clearly inhabited by the Kokiri, and how it was created and subsequently abandoned. Also, if you're interested in the Kokiri side of things, Bandit actually did a theory recently about that exact topic and how it ties to the monkeys that currently occupy the temple, as well as the nearby Ordon village. I believe it will be linked in the description below if you'd like to check it out.
Next up, we're actually going to skip straight to the Arbiter's grounds, because reasons. Whenever a Zelda game introduces a darker themed dungeon, typically that dungeon instantly becomes the fan favorite of the game, and the same is true of the Arbiter's grounds, because it's got it all. Unnerving atmosphere, the undead enemies, the chilling soundtrack, the memorable boss, and plenty of lore implications literally everywhere. So let's start by explaining the name Arbiter's grounds. In the original Japanese, it's actually referred to as Sabaku no Shokeijo, which means desert execution ground. Of course, in English, we refer to it as the Arbiter's grounds, or the Arbiter's keep if you translate the Hylian text on the map, with the word arbiter literally meaning a decider, especially in regards to an argument or a trial. In reality, the grounds themselves served both of these purposes. It was a large prison where the worst criminals of Hyrule were tried and sentenced mostly to death, some to banishment, and others to both, actually. But what is this place really? Who built it? And why is it out here in the middle of literally nowhere? Well, I'll tell you what I think, and the answer is unfortunately not super cut and dry. See, the symbols and imagery within the Arbiter's grounds seems to be a clash of cultures. On the one hand, we have Hylian culture depicted by the very familiar Hylian royal crest and even symbols of the sages, who serve the goddess Hylia. On the other hand, we have Gerudo culture with several statues depicting the serpent-clad sand goddess, who fans may recognize from the Desert Colossus and Spirit Temple in Ocarina of Time as the Gerudo's deity that they presumably worship, even though that's an assumption and has never been stated outright from the Gerudo. So in my opinion, the Arbiter's grounds was built actually in conjunction between the Hylians and the Gerudo, and I also happen to think that it's a very ancient place, honestly largely due to its appearance alone. I mean, I doubt this could all be built out of mighty stone pillars and then turned into ruins over the span of a mere 1 to 200 years, which is the amount of time Aonuma himself states took place between Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess. There's also an old language written on the walls of the Arbiter's grounds that to this day still doesn't fit within any known language script inside the Zelda universe, meaning it's most likely an ancient forgotten language, which wouldn't even be the last time this game deals with ancient forgotten languages, but more on that later. What this all means is that the Arbiter's grounds most likely long predates the events of Ocarina of Time, and when you think about it this way, new questions begin to arise, such as, were the Gerudo and Hylians allies way back in the day who built this giant coliseum together? What if long ago in the ancient age of Hyrule, if you will, the early Hylians and Gerudo Gerudo were actually one and the same. This actually makes sense on multiple different levels. For instance, from the real-life modern understanding of how evolution works, if you rewind the clocks by a few millennia, cultures and even species will be much less diverse. And in-universe, we know that at least as far back as in Skyward Sword, the Gerudo as a race did not exist yet, which pretty much proves they were all the same race at one point. Now, the combined ancient Hylians and Gerudo people, the Hyrudos if you will, would have still had their royal family that follows the bloodline of the goddess Hylia, which stems from the first ages of life on the surface as alluded to in Skyward Sword. And as I already mentioned, Hylians are named after and are all the children of the goddess Hylia. So here's a thought: what if the goddess of the sand is actually an early depiction of Hylia herself, which the ancient Hyrudo architects of the Arbiter's grounds worshipped? It's female, like Hylia and the rest of the goddesses, and it's always depicted as wrapped in a serpent, which historically has always symbolized fertility or life. It would also explain the strange appearance of the royal crest, sage symbols, and goddess of the sand being all in the same place, which is otherwise unexplainable. And given that the Gerudo and the Hylians really were once the same race, I doubt that the sand goddess would depict only one of the three golden goddesses, such as Din, which is another popular consensus for who the sand goddess is. It's not like they didn't know about the triune nature of the three golden goddesses. I mean, all three of them are depicted around the Hylian throne, so in my opinion, the sand goddess being Hylia herself actually makes the most sense. But now to the next question: why was it built as a coliseum? Isn't that a bit strange, you know, for a prison? Even ancient prisons were built differently with jail cells and whatnot, but a coliseum on the other hand only serves one purpose, and it's not exactly for imprisonment. If you saw my previous video on the boss lore of Twilight Princess, you probably already know where I'm going with this. But basically, my thought process is as follows. In the age following the first Zelda and Link's repopulation of the surface, technology advancements most likely took a huge dive, plunging the land that would eventually be called Hyrule into its ancient ages. And just like our own real-life ancient ages, the royal family, which are devout and religious, eventually constructed a coliseum in the Lanayru Desert, which is the old Gerudo Desert, in order to honor their goddess by way of gladiatorial combat. And before you think that would never happen, remember it did happen in our own real-life history, and the royal family of Hyrule has done many shady things behind closed doors for basically the entirety of the history of Hyrule. Case in point, the Shadow Temple or the onslaught against the Sheikah in Breath of the Wild. Eventually, of course, the Colosseum was deemed immoral and abandoned, until years later when the Interloper War took place, which as most fans know, ended with the interlopers all being subdued by the light spirits and subsequently banished. Banished where? To the Twilight Realm. Banished how? By way of the Mirror of Twilight atop the Desert Colosseum, and this is how I believe the Arbiter's grounds got its name, because it was at this point that the fate of the interlopers was decided. It's unknown how much, if at all, the grounds was used following this event, but the next recorded criminal to be processed at the grounds was Ganondorf himself, who was initially supposed to be executed before the sages resorted to banishing him as well. Not before he claimed one of their lives, though. Since that day, the Arbiter's grounds has not only been abandoned, but is actually forbidden to enter, according to Auru. But that doesn't change the fact that there are still powerful spirits lingering within its ancient halls. But I won't go into that here just to avoid being redundant. If you would like to know how those spirits and Zant and the various undead and Star-Lord and even Ganondorf himself fit into the puzzle that is the Arbiter's grounds, check out my Twilight Princess boss lore video if you haven't already. One of the most interesting takeaways from that video is that if you look
Moving on, the Lakebed Temple is one of the easier dungeons to explain in the entire Legend of Zelda franchise because, in truth, it may actually be the second appearance of the Water Temple from Ocarina of Time. Just to follow suit with Twilight Princess's whole taking Ocarina of Time's content and making it better shtick. Although there have been a few things that happened to it in between games to explain its different appearance. Firstly, we know it's the same temple as the old Water Temple because it's a Zora temple located at the bottom of Lake Hylia. Seriously, how many can there be? Only one, hopefully. I don't think we could take any more than that. But in all seriousness, it's even roughly designed the same way, with multiple rising water levels, and 4 directions, and a large central piece in the middle of the dungeon. Although now it's a giant spinning staircase instead of a multi-story room. Something that I think is important to note in this game is, once again, the disappearance of another nature spirit from Ocarina of Time, the water spirit Jabu Jabu. We know that the Lakebed Temple used to be a place of worship for the Zora people back when it was called the Water Temple, and as Bandit theorized in the boss lore video for Ocarina of Time, it's very possible that progressing through and completing the Water Temple's complexity was, in and of itself, a form of worship for the Zora people. However, if they no longer have a water spirit to worship since Jabu Jabu is currently MIA, then what other purpose could the temple possibly serve? once again, enter the fused shadow relic. Since the light spirits entrusted the 4 pieces to the Kokiri, Gorons, Zora, and apparently Gerudo or Twilight, and since we already know that the Gorons built contraptions within their minds, specifically to ward off wayward intruders from discovering the fused shadow held within, which by the way we go into in my video on my channel, why couldn't the Zora have done the same with their water temple? What better way to serve the gods and provide worship than to place the fused shadow relic they were sworn to protect within their already complex temple, and spruce it up with some new puzzles and rooms? And to be honest, it's a nearly foolproof plan. I mean, even Midna states that the place is seriously confusing. The Zora really do have a knack for designing the most infuriating puzzles known to Hyrule.
The last Twilight Princess dungeon that we're going to cover in this part of our collab is also probably the most mysterious and elusive of them all, and that would be the City in the Sky. But don't worry, I'm pretty sure we've got this one all figured out, at least as much as possible given the elusive nature of the lore. Let's start with what the scholarly Shad, who's obsessed with the Uka, tells us in-game. He states that the City in the Sky is the home of an ancient race of highly advanced pre-Hylian people who were even more connected to the gods than the modern day Hylians. And we actually do meet these people in-game, and they have one of the most unfortunate designs in the entire series. Say hello to the Uka, the ancient race of chicken people. And I can't tell if they look terrifying or funny. According to Shad, it was actually the Uka who were responsible for creating Hyrule, although he does admit that it's just a theory. Although if it is just a theory and it's not supposed to be taken as fact, I don't know why Nintendo would have included it in the game. But anyway, what he says is that while the people who lived on the surface founded Hyrule proper, as in the city and kingdom, the Uka were busy creating their flying city in the sky, after which they divested the Dominion Rod to the surface-dwelling Hylians should they ever need to speak with their siblings in the sky. There's more backstory that we could go into regarding the Uka and their technologies, but I want to focus specifically on what the City in the Sky is and why it was made in the first place. Now let me hit you with another idea that may come as a shock to you that branches off of what I talked about in the Arbiter's Ground segment. What if it wasn't just the Hylians and the Gerudo that used to be the same race? What if all of the humanoid races of Hyrule are actually each the different evolutions of the original race of Hylia people? Meaning the Gerudo, the Minish, the Zora, the Rito, maybe even the Gorons and the Hylians themselves all originate from a singular race that lived with Hylia long ago in the first era of the world, before Hylia's battle with Demise. But due to living in different environments and biomes, and with the passage of tens and even hundreds of thousands of years, they evolved into their own separate races of humanoids over time. I mean, in Skyward Sword, it's not like the Zora or the Rito or the Gerudo exist yet, so they must have been evolved into. There's not much solid evidence to support this besides the speculations I mentioned, but just bear with me. The more you think about it this way, the more everything makes sense, and ultimately the more explainable the City in the Sky becomes. See, if all Hyruleans stemmed from a singular race that then evolved into the different races we know of today, then that already explains how modern Hylians evolved from, or rather simultaneously alongside, the Uka. And it also explains why the Uka wished to live in the sky, because if they share a history with what we know happened with Hylians in the past, then they used to live in Skyloft alongside their fellow Skyloftians, which, as we know, is a vital part of the history of modern-day Hylians and why their royal crest features a loftwing, which is a species of bird that has since allegedly gone extinct. If this is the case, then wouldn't it be plausible that just like some Hyruleans decided to live in the mountains, some in the desert, some in the water, and some in the grassy fields, that some would then decide to live in the skies above, like they used to on Skyloft? Another important thing to note is that the Uka as they seem today might not be how they looked when they built the City in the Sky in the ancient times. I mean, just look at this thing. I'm pretty sure you need opposable thumbs to build this stuff. In fact, an early concept art for the race looked like this, which is much more human looking, with ape-like arms and feet while also sporting feathers and a beak hat. Or maybe that's a second face. Given that Twilight Princess was developed after the Wind Waker, which featured the brand new race of bird-like people known as the Rito, could it be that the Uka of Twilight Princess are in fact the child timeline variants of the Rito? Or maybe a branch of the Rito? Thanks to this strange mural that has been enhanced in Twilight Princess HD, we can see that the Rito did exist at some point in the past. And right next to the panel depicting the Rito, we can see the Uka and Azora. And while there are many theories that could be derived from the single mural, way too many to get into in this video, it does seem to prove either way that the Rito existed in the history of the child timeline. But that begs the question, if they did exist, where are they now? And furthermore, what if what it depicts mechanics is actually the passage of time for the Hyrulean people. For instance, the Rito could have evolved from the earlier Hylian and Goron races. Then they could have split into the evolutions of the Uka and Zora. Keep in mind that this mural could be depicting ancient times, possibly an era well before Ocarina of Time. Like I was saying though, there are many different ways to interpret this mural, this being just one of them. And I'm not trying to imply that I have it 100% definitely correct, but for the purposes of explaining the city in the sky, we're gonna go with this for now. And don't ask me about the little Link in the mural, I have no clue what he's doing there, but he do be kinda cute. I guess one way that we could explain little Link here would be what he did in between the events of Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. Perhaps he went around uniting all the races of Hyrule, some of which are the Rito and the Uka. Although if you think about it, that could still be true and fit with this explanation of the city in the sky. But anyway, back to explaining the city in the sky. To summarize, it's our speculative belief that it was probably created by an ancient race of Hylians that was a combination of many of the Hyrulean races we see today, which is why the Uka are said to be the predecessors of the modern Hylians. This ancient race may have even been the Rito, or evolved into the Rito, or evolved from the Rito. There's a lot of different races evolving to and from each other. It's kind of hard to keep track of it all. But anyway, this explains why they have a shared history with modern Hylians and why they wanted to live in the skies above, like they used to on Skyloft. And given another large passage of time, the ancient Uka that might have looked like the flying bird like Rito, or maybe even looked like this once, then evolved into smaller walking birds that now look like this, which is why they have at least one humanoid feature remaining, that being their faces. They never forgot about their surface-dwelling Hylian siblings though, which is why they created the Dominion Rod with the sole purpose of uncovering the ancient sky language and thus enabling the holder of the rod, known as the Messenger to the Heavens, to ascend to the city in the sky and converse with the Uka. And that about wraps up the explanation on the mystifying city in the sky, and apologies for getting into some heavy speculation there. Like I said, it's gotta be one of the most vague dungeons in the history of the series. But given the pieces of evidence that we do have and some what-if questions, I think we've got a solid explanation to use. But we're not done yet, because that's only half of Twilight Princess dungeons. For the other 4, head on over to NintendoBlackCrisis' channel where you'll find our other part live right now. Unless you're coming from there to here, in which case, hooray, you made it to the end! Give yourself a pat on the back.
Thanks for watching, everyone. Always a pleasure being here talking about the Zeldas. You should definitely play this game if you haven't yet. Here's hoping that Nintendo actually ports this as well as Wind Waker HD to the Switch. And if you want to see the other half of this collaboration, make sure to click the link in the description.
Thank you so much for watching. Please consider leaving a like if you enjoyed it, or if you enjoyed our efforts into making it, and subscribe if you haven't already to stick around for many more deeply interesting video game videos to come. Huge thanks as always to my bandit crew, of which Dr. Ohm7 recently just joined up. And that's all I've got for this one, so follow me on my socials, and I look forward to seeing you over in the other video. This is Bandit going over there. Peace!